Welcome to Dharma Talk. My name's Matthew Sokolov, one of the teachers here at One Mind Dharma. And this is our first real episode of our revamp of Dharma Talk, so I'm pretty excited. Just a few kind of logistical or announcement things to get out of the way. You can visit oneminddharma.com/talk to learn more about the podcast, find the links to subscribe on Google Play Music or Google Podcasts, iTunes, subscribe via email or find the YouTube channel. Also, a little button to support the podcast and donate. As always, if you have any thoughts or questions about something I say or a question you want me to answer on air, you can always email me at matthew@oneminddharma.com. And the last thing I want to throw out there is we got asked via email about meditation and working with anger, and it's a topic I'll touch on a little bit today with the equanimity. But I just wanted to throw out there that if you go to oneminddharma.com/blog, we have a new blog up on meditation and anger and mindfulness and self-compassion and these different kind of ways to work with anger. And I even recorded a couple meditations that you can't find on the YouTube channel up. I think they're going to go up next week, but they are in that post if you want to go to oneminddharma.com/blog. If anger or working with anger is something that interests you. So with that, we're going to jump into today's topic. And, after the topic, we'll kind of do what we used to always do and plan on continuing to do. There'll be a couple announcements. We'll answer some questions that we received this week. I have two. They're relatively interesting questions, I think, questions that one of them I haven't heard before, so I'm excited to kind of investigate that together. But first, let's talk about equanimity. Equanimity is, as many of you know, the fourth Brahma Vihara or heart practice. And I kind of wanted to split this up into a few pieces. One is give the kind of boring background of equanimity and look at what it means. Two, talk about how to cultivate it, because so often we hear about these wholesome qualities or things that are skillful or lead us toward awakening, but not really pragmatic about how to cultivate it. And then three, not real world, but everyday living and equanimity and how it relates. So the word equanimity in English comes from two words in the Pali Canon, upekkha and tatra majatata. And we're going to go through those in just a moment. But first I want to break down the etymology of the word equanimity or equanimous in English. Aqueous means even or stable, and animus is Latin. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Means mind, or sometimes it's translated as soul or being. So we can think of it as even-mindedness, even being, even soul, or stable-mindedness or stable soul. I think I've shared this on the podcast before, it can be interesting to understand the etymology of words and what they're really pointing at. So the first word that we hear often in the suttas, and it's what is described in the heart practices, is upekkha. And upekkha comes from Pali, and the u means superior, and you may have heard that with Sayadaw U Pandita, and not superior in a bad or condescending way, but as in a great way. So u and pekka means to spectate. So it means to kind of spectate over, which to me carries with it this connotation of not interfering. One of the greatest ways I've heard it described was at a talk at Spirit Rock, and it was Oren J. Sofer teaching. And he said it's like grandparents who observe or spectate their grandkids growing up. And they see, maybe some harm being caused. They see them maybe arguing. They see them experience great joy. And they spectate and they have compassion and they have mudita and they wish all the best for them, but they don't really interfere because that's not their position or role. So I always liked that image of the loving grandparents who are present and caring and open-hearted, but don't interfere, just kind of observing. The other word that's we translate, and it's interesting, there are two words that we translate from the Pali Canon as just equanimity when you read the suttas in English. And this is a word that's more related to equanimity as a quality of the mind. It's used in many of the concentration practices and in some of the mindfulness practices. And it's Tatra Majatata. And again, I'm going to break this down. Tatra means there. Maja means middle. You may have heard it in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length discourses. And tata means stand. So it really just means to stand in the middle of, or to stand in the midst of. And I love this etymology and kind of breakdown as well, because it points toward equanimity as this really involved standing in the middle of. And I know this may seem kind of counter, spectating over, or superior spectating, as I just discussed. But to me, it points towards the same thing with the grandparents, to stand in the middle of, to be present with love. It's not backing away or pushing something away. So, and we'll go over the subtleties of it in a moment. There's lots of stories and teachings on equanimity. It's a huge teaching in the suttas. One of the ones I really like, where it kind of lays out equanimity with other people, is the story of Anathapindika, who is known as the helper of the orphans or needy people. Not that orphans are needy, but that's how it's often translated, those who could benefit from help. And he was a rich lay person, not a monk. He actually was the one who bought Jeta Grove in Shravasti, or Jetavana in the suttas, where the Buddha gave many of his teachings. Anyways, he had a relative, the story goes, who spent a lot of money, was kind of like a mooch. I don't know if that's the most acceptable word, and I apologize if, as I'm saying it, that word could have really harmful roots. Anyways, he just was always asking for money, and Anathapindika said no. And what happened to his relative, sometimes it's said the brother or cousin, was the relative fell into debt and kind of fell into some disrepair, was homeless, and eventually died of just malnourishment and unhealthy living. And Anathapindika felt terrible, as anyone would in this situation. They set a boundary, and there's a hope within us when we set a boundary that it's going to be all work out perfect and the person's going to change their path. But it's not always that way. But the Buddha said to Anathapindika that you can't help someone who doesn't appreciate the joy when they had it, right? When they had the money and they had the love and the support, they didn't appreciate it. And furthermore, you had pure intentions in giving them the money and cutting them off. So there needs to be some equanimity there. And I think that's a great illustration of, we can care for somebody all we want, but what they do or how they behave is not within our control. I'll talk about that more when we get into the kind of pragmatic piece. One of the ways equanimity is often talked about in the suttas is freedom from the 8 worldly winds: praise and blame, gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and disrepute. These 8 worldly winds that we're all subject to. True equanimity is freedom from these things. When we're no longer sucked in by praise or blame, by the pleasure and pain. So I would think that's a, idealistic way to look at it, like a great intention to set for ourselves. But that's a tough one. It takes work and cultivation. We're almost to that part. There's also the piece of the separation between worldly equanimity and unworldly equanimity. Worldly equanimity is equanimity at the 6 sense doors. So when something causes pain, experiencing the pain perhaps with equanimity, or when something causes pleasure, happiness, distress. And there's a really interesting sutta called the Katapama Sutta, where the Buddha points out that often we have pain or pleasure after the actual contact has left, or even the feeling of unpleasant. So we hear an unpleasant noise, and we kind of suffer over it and wish it was gone. And the noise is already gone, and we're still suffering. And the same can be said for equanimity. Sometimes we have something arise, and we have this real sense of openness and equanimity with it. And the stimulus is gone, but we can kind of retain that equanimity. So, worldly equanimity of responding to anything at the six sense doors, anything we smell, see, taste, hear, feel, or think. And then unworldly equanimity, which is kind of I don't want to say highest form of equanimity, because they're apples to oranges and one's not better, but a form of equanimity that is cultivated further along the path is the unworldly equanimity that comes in the fourth jhana, or concentrative state. And I'm frankly not even going to go into that because I don't have any experience with the fourth jhana, and I don't feel comfortable teaching about it. So I'll leave that there. So that's kind of like a boring for many people, but a foundational look at equanimity and the kind of different pieces of it. Obviously, that's a huge kind of roll over it. I didn't include everything. It's so brief and just touching on little things that I found interesting. I encourage you to look further into it, but I just wanted to offer those couple pieces of the kind of two forms of equanimity, as far as standing in the middle of and spectating, or the equanimity of the mind and heart. The worldly winds, the working with others in equanimity, and the sense doors. So as far as cultivating it goes, and what it really looks like, and I think we'll start with what it really looks like. Equanimity is described by different teachers in so many different ways. When I first came to meditation, I could wrap my head around metta, or loving kindness, wishing well for people. I could understand intellectually, at least, even if I wasn't feeling these things or knowing them in my bones. I understood compassion, caring for the suffering or pain. I understood mudita, or appreciative joy, rejoicing in this happiness. Those all kind of make sense. Equanimity is a word that I don't think I've ever heard outside of a Dharma context or mindfulness or Buddhist context. And it's kind of, I think that a lot of times we can have misconceptions about what it is. I'll start by just saying that what it's not is apathy. Apathy is actually the near enemy of equanimity. So that's a quality that kind of looks similar, maybe even the experience is similar, but it's not the same. It's often described as apathy or indifference, which can be seen as similar qualities. And the difference between apathy and equanimity is, with apathy, we're not getting attached, but we're also kind of turning away, or a lack of care or presence. Same with indifference, right? With equanimity, we're intensely present with something, but we're not attached so much. One of the ways I like to describe equanimity is a balance. And it's not about being rigid, because sometimes we can think that, like, we're going to be rigid with our practice, and no matter what comes up, we're just going to be so kind and so mindful. But I think equanimity is like a tree. It requires some ability to bend while still staying rooted. And perhaps the best example or description of equanimity is that of the salt water. And this is an illustration of equanimity as spaciousness. So if you took a tablespoon of salt and put it in a normal size glass of water, an 8-ounce glass of water, and you drank that water, it would be quite salty. We would definitely taste the salt. It might even be an unpleasant amount. If you took a tablespoon of salt and dumped it in a huge freshwater lake, Lake Erie. And you dumped that tablespoon of salt, mixed it up in the whole lake, and took a sip of that water, you probably wouldn't even taste the salt. It's the same exact stimulus, right? The same exact salt. But with the spaciousness of Lake Erie, it's not felt as strongly, if at all. And that's what equanimity is this allowing things to come up and move through us, but not tightening around them. Can think of equanimity as not getting knocked so far off balance by experience. When something unpleasant happens, allowing it to be unpleasant, maybe even allowing it to hurt, but not knocking us so far off. Or the same can be said, and I think it's actually more difficult, when we experience something really pleasant, not falling into that leaning towards it so hard and the craving and clinging, but experiencing the pleasure and the joy and appreciating it and enjoying it, but staying balanced and kind of stable. So, as far as cultivating this quality, the most obvious example is equanimity meditation. And there's, I think, two pieces of equanimity that are often, one of them's not talked about in practice, in actual meditation practice. The first one that is talked about is equanimity as a heart practice, where we work with other people, and we use equanimity phrases like we do with the other heart practices. And some of the phrases vary, and they're often kind of long, but the common ones include, all beings are in charge of their own karma, or all beings are in charge of their own behavior. All beings are heirs to their own karma, or your happiness depends on your actions, not my wishes for you. And these can be coupled really beautifully with some phrases of metta or compassion. By bringing someone up and wishing well for them, may you be happy and healthy and safe and at ease, and may you take the action necessary to be at ease. Recognizing this is the equanimity with other people, that story of the grandparents and the spectating but not interfering. If you're familiar with 12-step programs, I call it the Al-Anon heart practice. The loving and caring, but recognizing that we can't cause, cure, or control someone else's joy or suffering. We can definitely create suffering in other people with our behavior or cause harm, and we can definitely speak and act in a way that promotes awakening, but not to take on how someone else is feeling for ourselves. It's important to understand that this doesn't mean turning away or being cold towards someone. It's actually what allows us to really have compassion. It's like the container that holds the rest of the heart practices. When we have compassion for someone who's suffering, and we lean in kind of to suffer with them, right? Compassio, to suffer with, and allow ourselves to really feel the pain, and it can be quite uncomfortable, true compassion, or rather unpleasant in moments. Equanimity is what allows us to kind of keep the right distance, where we're not falling into codependency or taking it on ourselves, but we're still truly present. We're not going into aversion. So that's the equanimity of working with other people and how it's often cultivated or taught. But there's also this quality of equanimity within ourselves, not just with other people. I think the same can be said for all heart practices, especially metta, that we can also practice metta toward our own experience. And I've led meditations, if you subscribe to our meditation podcast in this, where we offer phrases instead of to other beings. I offer the phrases, may my mind be at ease, may I be at ease with the mind. May the body be at ease, may I be at ease with the body. So cultivating some metta toward our own experience. And we can see this in meditation practice when a thought comes up and we respond to it with metta or loving kindness, or when we don't and we really hate something or want to get rid of it or are harsh towards it. And the same can be said for equanimity. When we're practicing, we can benefit from really noticing when equanimity is present and when something's not. And this is the Katapama Sutta. The Buddha says that, to know when something's causing pain or pleasure, happiness or distress, or equanimity. So in our mindfulness practice, whether we're focusing on the breath or we're doing an open awareness or body scan, one of the ways we can cultivate equanimity is by really paying attention to when it's present and when it's not, by noticing when we're knocked off balance in our practice, by noticing when we feel really stable. Sometimes I notice it in my practice. I'll be sitting, everything's going along as normal. I'm having some thoughts about why am I doing this, and I'm thinking about some food, and I'm analyzing, and I'm having mindful breaths in between. And everything's kind of going along, and then I notice, oh, my mind's wandered, and I can feel myself tighten and start to beat myself up. And that's a great opportunity to recognize, whoa, there's a lack of equanimity there. On the other hand, sometimes I notice the mind wander, and I go, oh, the mind wandered, and I come right back. And to also notice, wow, that's what equanimity is like, to experience it. As we can name it and note it and point to it, put our fingers on it, we begin to familiarize ourselves with it. So that would be my recommendation in practice, is we can, of course, do equanimity meditation. I do it myself. I'm not against that, but I think that's half of the piece of the puzzle. The other piece is to notice this quality when it's present or not in any practice you're doing. It doesn't have to just be an insight practice. It could be a heart practice, could be walking meditation, it could be yoga. Notice when equanimity is present or not, especially when you get knocked off balance. So the couple other pieces I have about how to cultivate, and I've gotten these from various teachers and daylongs and books and some of my own investigation. So some of these are mine. I won't be offended if they don't work for you, and some of them come from other teachers and I won't be offended, but I want to throw them all out there kind of briefly. One is do a lot of Vedana practice. Notice the feeling tone of experience in meditation. When we can do that and really notice that something's pleasant or unpleasant, we can jump in before the strong liking or disliking and then craving or aversion. Where equanimity happens is we experience something, we find it pleasant, let's say, we like it, and then we go into craving or clinging. It's in between liking it and craving or clinging that we either have equanimity or we don't. And the same can be said for unpleasant, disliking, and we can notice that disliking with equanimity, or we can just allow it to kind of pull us into aversion or hatred. So the Vedana practice can really help. The other thing you can do in daily life is notice when you're liking or disliking something. I know those are generic or kind of vague terms, but try to notice and see if you can catch those moments of liking or disliking and intervene with some equanimity, allowing some spaciousness and allowing some non-reactivity for it to be there before falling into craving or aversion. Another great way to go is to, as this is the third time I brought it up, the Katapama Sutta, notice the lingering feeling that's mentioned there. That when something stimulates us at one of the sense doors, and we dislike it and there's like a tightening or discomfort and the stimulus is already gone, if we can notice in that moment that it's just a lingering feeling, that can really help us have some equanimity toward it a lot sooner. Instead of letting it kind of distract us or hurt us or cause suffering all day long, we can kind of bring in the equanimity and, work with it a little bit sooner. Next, notice your responses to the worldly winds. Familiarize yourself with them. There's 8. I believe in your potential to memorize them if you haven't done so. Praise and blame, gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and disrepute. And you might see other translations of this, but praise and blame. So when we do something good and someone praises us, or when we do something wrong and people blame us. Gain and loss, so getting things and losing things. Pleasure and pain, which is sometimes described as pleasant and unpleasantness. And fame and disrepute. So notice when you're praised, most of us will fall into some clinging around it. And blame as well. We'll beat ourselves up or even cling to that identity. Notice these things. So the last way I think that, or the last way, obviously there are many ways, but the last kind of thought or experience I've had as far as cultivating equanimity, especially outside of meditation, is to really invite in metta or loving kindness. I call it gentleness when I work with myself into, as mentioned, with the thoughts and the heart and the body. So when you find yourself suffering or in some moment of pain or discomfort, offer yourself a few phrases of metta and then a few phrases of equanimity. May I be open to this. May I be spacious in this moment. But by bringing up metta first, just for a moment, maybe just a phrase like, may I be at ease, or may I care about this suffering, a phrase of compassion, we can kind of set the tone to care for it and not turn away from it while still allowing there to be room. Because the problem is, if we don't, the tendency to, when we're cultivating equanimity, may be to actually go into indifference or apathy. And it's a subtle difference, and we don't always see it, is the truth. So why practice equanimity? First of all, I'm actually going to go back. Equanimity is not about being a doormat or being complacent. It's not saying that you should allow spaciousness for someone to cause harm to you. It's not saying that with the radical kind of suffering that the country is experiencing, and actually, I almost said this country, but I live in Mexico, but that too. But the radical amount of pain that I've seen in the United States recently, where I'm from, in this kind of social justice movements, equanimity doesn't mean we shouldn't be a part of those or we should just sit back. I think that's a misunderstanding of it, and it's a question we often receive about equanimity. Rather, I think that what equanimity does is it allows us to experience the pain or the hurt of what's going on, whether it's individual or societal. It allows us to experience, when we make space, we're not quite as reactive. And what happens is we can look at it with some insight and clarity and see the pain, and we can actually take action out of clarity and with more wisdom than just a reaction. So it is pausing for a moment, but it's also allows us to see clearly. Equanimity also in the suttas is taught as one of the ways to remove doubt in practice and in life. It's one of the ways that we live with integrity. And it leads to, more balance and stability. I'll read one more quote about equanimity before I wrap it up. Beings are the owners of their deeds. Whose, if not theirs, is the choice by which they will become happy, or will get free from suffering, or will not fall away from the success they have reached. So with that, we'll move into a few of the questions we got this week, which I'm pretty bad at picking questions, because as I do this, I'm like, oh, they're not related at all to the topic. That's okay. So the first question we got, and this was received by email, it was actually really funny. Someone subscribed to like the meditation challenge or free 7-week, 7 days of guided meditation thing or something. And they emailed me and said, I really want to learn how to sit in silence. I've been meditating for some time, and I don't know how long that is, but I've been meditating for some time. I'm familiar with the practices, but I always listen to guidance, and I want to learn to sit in silence. It's a great question. It's one that we've received before, both Elizabeth and I. And I gave an answer to this person, and then I actually talked about it with Elizabeth after, and she gave me some other ideas. So I'm gonna share those as well, on not on her behalf, but just recognizing I acquired them just recently from her. One thing I always say, if you want to learn to sit in silence, and I think that's a noble intention, because at some point we don't necessarily need the guidance, and it can be even somewhat of a hindrance or attachment. What I recommend is picking 2 practices, an insight practice and a heart practice. I often recommend that people stick to either mindfulness of the breath or a simple kind of open awareness practice for the mindfulness practice. And for the heart practice, working with self, so specifically self-metta or self-compassion. And if you need to, you can listen to a meditation of each one to really just kind of remind yourself of the practice. And then for a month, meditate every day, once a day, and switch between the insight and the heart. No guidance, just going how you go. And the reason I say for a month and just these two practices is we can really familiarize ourselves with them. When we skip around from practice to practice, like so many of us often do, we don't allow for the deepening of one practice really. And I think it can be useful to see if it's working or beneficial to just say, all right, for a month, I'm just going to do this and this. That's it. So that was my recommendation as to how to learn to start sitting in silence. You can also, of course, if you're doing, let's say, self-compassion and a mindfulness of the body, you can read a little bit about mindfulness of the body if you want to read suttas or some posts from your favorite teachers, and of course self-compassion. There are tons of posts and quotes and suttas and all different kinds of things we can read. Elizabeth also gave the piece that she said that really helped her, and she's offered to a couple of her students, is to read a meditation script to yourself. You can find them online. And you may read it out loud or you can read it in your head. But let's say you're going to do self-compassion. You can find a self-compassion meditation script and read it either in your head or out loud to yourself as you meditate. And maybe you can memorize it ahead of time, or maybe you actually have your eyes open and lead yourself. I like to think that a great way to do it would be to read the script, get the gist of it, and then when you meditate, lead yourself silently through the practice. So that's how I, would move into silence. I think it's all about what works for us. I know people that have been meditating for longer than I have who still listen to a guided meditation every single time, and there's nothing wrong with that. We can also pay attention to the attachments of what we think is, the best form of meditation. The other question that I wanted to address was one that I received in our live group. The live group is so generic, but I received in our online group on Wednesday nights. It's at 4 p.m. Pacific time and 7 p.m. Eastern time. But we were talking about, I don't even remember what the subject was. I think I kind of talked about the different pieces of mindfulness that you may have, if you've been listening to the podcast for some time, you've heard me talk about that. Mindfulness isn't just about being present. There's more to it. And she asked, what's the difference between awareness and recognition? These two words we hear in the Dharma or in the teachings, or she heard me saying. And it was a great question. Obviously, there's probably a different answer as far as neuroscience goes. As far as the aggregates go, kind of like Elizabeth and I have compared like Dharma to psychology and how similar and different they may be. But I'm going to give the answer that's kind of rooted in Dharma and in my experience, recognizing that this is one perspective on it and there may be others. Awareness is simply being present with something, being conscious or cognizant of it. Even right now in this moment, there are tons of things happening that your brain, your eyes, your ears, your nose are kind of processing in the background. The non-conscious mind is so much more efficient than our conscious mind or brain. So awareness is when something comes into that conscious mind. I'll use the example of if you were standing outside in a little park and there was a cute labradoodle and a beautiful but large dire wolf. As you walked there and saw the two of them, the awareness is that there's two creatures here. You would immediately recognize them. The recognition piece is recognizing that's a labradoodle. It looks pretty harmless and cute, that's a big, scary, feral wolf. And, I'm not saying we need to harm it in any way, but we recognize that may not be as safe in that moment to us. So the same can be said for our thoughts or for our experience or behavior. I often use the example that mindfulness is not just punching somebody in the face and doing it with awareness that we're doing it, right? It's not just being present. It's not just having something in our awareness. We also need the recognition piece. And the word sati that we get mindfulness from, the Pali word that is used in the suttas, actually means to remember or to recognize. So what is recognition? Recognition is, and we can break it down again to recognize, but recognition is using past information. So for example, let's say that we're having a thought about, I'm going to skip work today even though I'm not sick because screw it or whatever. Awareness is seeing that thought come up, noticing its presence. Recognition is recognizing, oh, look, that's a thought out of aversion because I just don't want to go to work. And if I don't go to work, that's not really wholesome and it's going to cause me suffering. On the other hand, maybe we're feeling a little sick or we do need a mental health day. And in that case, the recognition would be, all right, this is a wholesome thought and it's self-care and it's leading me to towards liberation, not towards suffering. So there's two pieces here to mindfulness that are important. The presence or awareness, having something in our conscious mind, and the recognition, the using past information and recognizing what may happen in the future. In this sense, the recognition piece is explicitly not about the present moment. So when people say it's just about being present, it's simply wrong. And the awareness piece is really about being present with it. And the recognition is, using past information. We know if something's skillful or unskillful or causes harm or not, largely because of how we've experienced in the past. And the future piece of recognition is, of course, not getting lost in what may or may not happen. But sometimes we know if we do this, it will cause harm in the future to myself or to someone else or another being or collective beings. So I think that's important. All right. This podcast has been too long. If Elizabeth was here, she would be wrapping it up for me because she's good at that. And I just talk forever and I'm good at that. But it's because I love these teachings. I'm passionate about it. The Dharma has been so impactful in my life and Elizabeth's as well. And I love this practice of equanimity. I think it's so rich. It's such fertile ground to have some spaciousness with our practice and in our lives. So just a few things wrapping up. You can always join us if you want for our online group. It's donation-based. It's on Zoom. You can just download Zoom on your phone or on your computer. You can shut your video off or turn it on. You can participate or observe. It's a relatively small group. We have anywhere from 4 people to 10 people. And it's just class.oneminddharma.com. class.oneminddharma.com. And the way the registration works is you just get on an email list, and every week we send out the link a few hours ahead of time. We also have some meditation programs that are relatively new. They came out a few months ago. They've been doing pretty well. We've gotten a lot of wonderful feedback and been working with them. It's oneminddharma.com/programs. I try to do pretty good notes in front of myself, and I didn't this time, so I don't remember what all of them are. But we have one that's like working with anxiety, one that's living with gratitude, 10 days to better sleep. There's a heart practice one that I did that I really liked. I can't remember the name, opening the heart or something. And they're kind of just meditation, they're either 5 days or 10 days or 15 days or 30 days of, really concentrating on not one specific practice, but one specific theme. So those are at oneminddharma.com/programs. And just to note, if you're a member, those are free for you and they're in your member portal. So if you're already a member, you're thinking about joining, those are all included, and we're working on releasing some new ones. If you do want to join, that's always the best way to support One Mind Dharma, even if you don't want any of the offerings. It's oneminddharma.com/join. We have daily guided meditation emails we send out. You can download, participate in all the meditation programs you want. You can download the meditation scripts collection. We also have Elizabeth made a awesome collection of mindfulness exercises for like teenagers and groups and kids and adults. She's as many of you know, actually this is new, I guess, since she wasn't when the last time we did it, but she's now a licensed associate marriage and family therapist, so she uses them in her groups. And so anyways, that's what you get when you join. And that's oneminddharma.com/join. And I just want to end by again throwing my email out there, Matthew@oneminddharma.com. You're never bothering me. I get a lot of emails, and people say, I'm sorry to ask you such a silly question. There's no silly question. Ask me. If you're not sure about something, go ahead and ask. If you're not comfortable asking me for whatever reason, I don't need to know why. You're entitled to your own experience. You can always email it to info@oneminddharma.com, which Elizabeth and I both get. And you're also welcome to send it to Elizabeth@oneminddharma.com if you'd like her to answer a question. So with that, I will see you all next week. I wanted to give a topic and say, yeah, tune in next week for blah, blah, blah. But I actually don't know what the topic's going to be for next week. I'm going to look through my notes and see how my practice goes. So if there's something you want me to talk about, feel free to email me. And I will see you all next week.